I promise to make you feel alive that night.
The London season was a gilded cage, and Lady Elara Vance was its most reluctant prisoner. While every other debutante fluttered like a butterfly around the candlelight of potential suitors, Elara stood in the shadows of the ballroom, her heart a cold hearth. She didn't want a husband, she wanted a life that belonged to her. But then there was Arthur Penhaligon, the Duke of Blackwood. A man whose reputation was as dark as the midnight velvet of his coats, and whose eyes held a predatory intelligence that made Elara's skin prickle with a mixture of fear and something far more dangerous. Their rivalry was the talk of the town. Every encounter was a clash of wits, a volley of sharp insults veiled in polite society's etiquette. He called her a frigid intellectual, she called him an arrogant libertine. But beneath the barbs was a pull, a magnetic tension so thick it felt like a physical weight between them. That night, at the masquerade ball at Vauxhall Gardens, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and scandal. Arthur had cornered her near the labyrinth, his voice a low growl that vibrated in her chest. "You pretend to be so composed, Elara," he whispered, stepping into her personal space until she could feel the heat radiating from him. "But I see the fire behind those emerald eyes. You're dying to feel something. Anything." Elara's breath hitched. "And I suppose you think you're the one to ignite it, Your Grace?" "I don't think." "I know," he countered, his hand hovering just inches from her waist, never touching, yet the proximity felt like a burn. "Tonight, I promise to make you feel alive. Truly alive. Meet me at the old oak by the lake when the clock strikes midnight." She should have said no. She should have turned back to the safety of the ballroom. But the hunger for something real, something beyond corsets and tea parties, pushed her forward. When midnight came, she found him waiting. The moon was a silver sliver, casting long, dramatic shadows. Elara expected a scandal, a stolen kiss, perhaps the ruin that her mother always warned her about. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. As she approached, Arthur didn't reach for her. He didn't try to pull her into an embrace. Instead, he stood with a heavy iron key in his hand and a look of profound, somber intensity. "You want to feel alive?" he asked, his voice devoid of its usual mockery. "Then you must see what lies beneath the surface of this glittering lie we live in." He led her not to a bedchamber or a secluded grove, but to the hidden cellar of his own estate, which shared a border with the gardens. What she found there changed everything. It wasn't a den of vice, but a sanctuary. He had been using his wealth and his libertine reputation as a cover to run an underground network, rescuing those the law ignored, orphans of the street, women fleeing abuse, scholars silenced by the crown. The tension between them shifted instantly. It was no longer just the friction of two bodies drawn together, it was the sudden, shattering realization that she didn't know him at all. And he, seeing the way she looked at a trembling child with such sudden, fierce protection, realized that her coldness was merely a shield for a soul too vast for Mayfair. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, the silence of the cellar echoing her heartbeat. Arthur stepped closer, his shadow engulfing hers. The air between them sparkled with a new kind of electricity, one born of mutual respect and a shared secret. "Because, Elara," he said, his hand finally grazing her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with agonizing slowness. "To trust you with this is to trust you with my life. And I find that far more terrifying than any duel I've ever fought." The enemies were gone, replaced by two souls standing on the edge of a precipice. The desire was still there, stronger now, fueled by the intimacy of the truth. He promised to make her feel alive, and in that dark, cold cellar, surrounded by the reality of a world she never knew existed, Elara Vance felt her heart beat for the first time in years. But the danger had just begun. To stay with him was to join a rebellion. To love him was to invite the wrath of an empire. The days following the encounter in the cellar were a blur of high society functions that felt more like a masquerade than ever before. Elara found herself standing in the same ballrooms, under the same crystal chandeliers, but the world had shifted on its axis. Every time her eyes met Arthur's across a crowded room, a jolt of electricity surged through her, a secret language spoken in the silence between breaths. He was no longer just the arrogant Duke of Blackwood, he was a man carrying the weight of the forgotten on his shoulders. And she? She was no longer a mere spectator. At the Lady Danbury's garden party, the heat of the afternoon sun was nothing compared to the warmth that flooded Elara's cheeks when Arthur approached her near the lemonade stand. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses and the hushed whispers of chaperones. "You look deep in thought, Lady Elara," Arthur said, his voice a low velvet caress that seemed to vibrate in the very air between them. "Or perhaps you are merely calculating your next insult?" Elara turned, her emerald eyes meeting his sapphire gaze with a newfound intensity. "I find my vocabulary for insults has diminished lately, Your Grace. I am preoccupied with more substantial matters." He stepped closer, breaching the unspoken boundary of propriety. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco clung to him, intoxicating and dangerously masculine. "Substantial matters can be perilous," he murmured, his eyes dropping briefly to her lips before snapping back to hers. "They require a certain fortitude. One I suspect you possess in abundance." The desire in his gaze was a physical force, a tether pulling her toward him. Elara felt a wave of longing so sharp it took her breath away, a desperate urge to reach out and trace the sharp line of his jaw, to feel the heat of his skin against hers. But they were surrounded by the 1,000 eyes waiting for a single slip, a single moment of unmasked passion. "I am stronger than I look," she replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Their enemies to lovers dynamic had evolved into something far more complex, a dance of shadows and light. Every sharp remark now carried a double meaning, every cold shoulder was a plea for a stolen moment in the dark. As the week progressed, the danger intensified. Lord Stirling, a man whose soul was as hollow as his titles, had begun to sniff around Arthur's affairs. He sensed a crack in the Duke's carefully constructed armor of debauchery. At the opera, Stirling cornered Elara in the corridor, his smile oily and predatory. "The Duke of Blackwood is a dangerous man to associate with, Lady Elara," Stirling hissed. "He plays a game that leads to the gallows. I would hate to see such a vibrant flower withered by his shadow." Elara felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't flinch. "I believe the Duke's shadows are far more honest than your sunlight, Lord Stirling." The confrontation only solidified her resolve. That night, she didn't wait for an invitation. She slipped out of her family's townhouse, dressed in a simple dark cloak, and made her way back to the hidden sanctuary. She found Arthur in his study, the room illuminated only by the dying embers of the fire. He looked exhausted, the sharp lines of his face softened by fatigue, yet he looked more beautiful to her in that moment than he ever had in a ballroom. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though he didn't move to send her away. "I know," she whispered, crossing the room until she stood before his desk. "But Stirling knows something. He's watching you, Arthur." At the sound of his name, he looked up, and for the first time, the mask of the Duke completely shattered. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor, and in 2 long strides, he was in front of her. The tension that had been building for weeks, the insults, the glances, the suppressed hunger, finally snapped. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. He took her face in his large hands, his palms rough yet incredibly gentle. "I promised to make you feel alive," he whispered against her forehead. "But I never promised it would be safe. I never promised it wouldn't break us both." "Then let us break," Elara replied, her hands finding his chest, feeling the frantic thrum of his heart beneath the fine linen of his shirt. The kiss, when it finally happened, was not a gentle thing. It was an explosion, a desperate collision of 2 souls who had been starving for each other in a desert of etiquette. It tasted of secrets, of rebellion, and of a love that defied every rule of their world. In that small, firelit room, the Duke of Blackwood and Lady Elara Vance were no longer characters in a social play. They were real. They were raw. And they were utterly, dangerously intertwined. But as they pulled apart, the sound of a distant whistle echoed through the night. A signal. The raid they had feared was beginning. The world was coming for them, and the night that changed everything was about to become a battle for survival. The whistle that pierced the night was a jagged blade, cutting through the newfound fragile peace of the study. Arthur's hands, which only moments ago had been cradling Elara's face with a reverence that bordered on worship, dropped to his sides. His jaw set, the Duke of Blackwood returned in an instant, his eyes turning into cold flint. "They're here," he said, his voice a low vibration. He didn't ask Elara how she felt or if she was scared. He didn't have to. He simply grabbed a pistol from the desk drawer and handed her a small, sharp dagger. "Do you know how to use this?" Elara looked at the cold steel, then back at him. "I've spent my life cutting through the pretenses of the ton, Your Grace. I think I can manage a bit of iron." "Good," Arthur grunted, a flicker of dark pride crossing his face. "Follow me. And whatever you do, do not leave my shadow." They moved through the corridors of the estate like ghosts. The sound of heavy boots hitting the gravel outside echoed through the stone walls. Lord Stirling had moved faster than they anticipated. This wasn't just a social ruin, it was an execution. They reached the cellar just as the first door was kicked in. The orphans and women were huddled in the back, their eyes wide with a terror that Elara felt mirrored in her own soul. But as she stood there, watching Arthur position himself between the innocent and the approaching soldiers, her fear transformed into a cold, hard resolve. "Arthur," she whispered, stepping up beside him. "The secret passage through the old wine rack. If we can get them to the woods, my family's carriage is waiting at the north gate. My driver is loyal to me, not the crown." Arthur looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a debutante he desired, but as a partner in a war he had been fighting alone. "You are a remarkable woman, Elara Vance. Save the compliments for when we aren't being hunted by the royal guard," she snapped, though a small smile touched her lips. The battle that followed was chaotic and swift. Arthur fought with a lethal grace, a man possessed. He was a storm of motion, protecting Elara at every turn, his body a shield. In the heat of the conflict, their eyes met, a brief, searing moment where the adrenaline and the suppressed passion of months fused into something unbreakable. Every time his hand brushed hers to pull her out of harm's way, it felt like a brand. They managed to lead the group into the damp, dark woods. The smell of pine and wet earth filled Elara's lungs as they ran. Behind them, the Duke's estate was being ransacked, but the heart of his mission was safe in the shadows of the trees. When they finally reached the safety of the Vance carriage, and the last child was tucked inside, the silence of the forest settled over them. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a raw, pulsing ache. Arthur leaned against a tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood from a shallow cut on his temple trickled down his cheek. Elara didn't think. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she wiped the blood away. Arthur caught her wrist, his grip tight, desperate. "Why did you stay?" he asked, his voice raw. "You could have run. You could have pretended you were never part of this." "Because I've never felt more alive than when I'm with you," she confessed, the truth hanging in the cool night air. "Even when I hated you, Arthur, I was more awake in our arguments than I was in a lifetime of polite conversation." He pulled her toward him then, crushing his mouth to hers. This wasn't the desperate kiss of the study, this was a vow. It was the taste of survival and the promise of a future that would have to be built in the wreckage of their old lives. But as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, they knew the reprieve was temporary. Lord Stirling hadn't found the people, but he had found something else, a ledger. Arthur's name was written in a book that branded him a traitor to the king. "They will come for me by noon," Arthur said, his gaze fixed on the rising sun. "Then we have 6 hours," Elara replied, her voice firm. 6 hours to turn the tide. "If Stirling wants a scandal, we will give him one. But not the one he expects." The plan was madness. They would return to the city. They would attend the most prestigious breakfast of the season, hosted by the Queen herself. If they could present themselves as a united front, and if Elara could use the information she had gathered about Stirling's own illegal dealings in the shipping trade, they could shift the narrative. "It's a gamble, Elara," Arthur warned as they rode back toward the city in the dim morning light. "If we fail, we both go to the tower." "I'd rather be in the tower with you than in a palace with anyone else," she said, her hand finding his under the carriage blanket. Their fingers intertwined, a silent pact made in the face of ruin. As they entered the city, the tension was a living thing between them. The desire was there, simmering under the surface of their tactical discussions, a reminder of what they were fighting for. The Duke who promised to make her feel alive had done more than that, he had given her a reason to fight. And she was going to make sure that whatever happened next, the world would never forget the name of Lady Elara Vance and the Duke of Blackwood. The carriage ride back to London felt like a journey through a dreamscape of gold and ash. Elara watched the dawnlight catch the sharp profile of Arthur's face. He looked every bit the formidable Duke, yet she knew the warmth of the man beneath the frozen exterior. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was a heavy, vibrating thing, filled with the memory of their kiss and the terrifying weight of what they were about to do. Every time the carriage jolted, and their shoulders brushed, a spark of electricity reignited, reminding her that they were tied together by more than just a secret. They were tied by a hunger that propriety could no longer starve. "You are staring, Elara," Arthur said, his voice a low, grovelly rasp that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't turn to look at her, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "I am observing my partner in crime," she countered, leaning back into the velvet cushions. "It is a rare sight to see the Duke of Blackwood looking so human. Usually, you are made of nothing but marble and arrogance." At that, he finally turned his head. His sapphire eyes were dark, clouded with a desire he was clearly struggling to contain. "And you, Lady Elara, were supposed to be the ice queen of the ballroom. Yet here you are, with a dagger in your dress and treason in your heart. I find I much prefer the traitor to the debutante." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the heat radiating from his skin made her breath hitch. This was the torture they excelled at, the proximity without the release. The love enemies game was reaching its zenith. They were no longer fighting each other, they were fighting the world, and the friction was intoxicating. "If we survive this morning," Elara whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "what happens to us? There is no going back to the way things were. The 10 will never look at us the same way." Arthur finally closed the distance, his fingers intertwining with hers, squeezing with a strength that was both possessive and protective. "The 10 is a stage for puppets, Elara. We have cut our strings. If we survive, we don't go back. We go forward. Together. In the light, or in the shadows, it doesn't matter, as long as I can look across a room and know that your fire matches mine." The carriage arrived at the Vance townhouse just as the city was waking up. They had 3 hours to transform from mud-stained fugitives into the most golden couple of the season. Elara's lady's maid, a woman who had seen Elara through every childhood scrape, didn't ask questions when her mistress returned at dawn. She simply went to work, weaving pearls into Elara's mahogany hair and lacing her into a gown of emerald silk so tight it felt like a second skin. Across the square, Arthur was doing the same. When they met again at the entrance to the Queen's breakfast, the transformation was complete. Arthur looked devastatingly handsome in a navy blue tailcoat, his cravat tied with lethal precision. But when his eyes met Elara's, she saw the predator again, the man who would burn the world down to keep her safe. The breakfast was a sea of pastel silks and hushed gossip. As they walked in, arm in arm, the room fell into a suffocating silence. The news of the disturbances at Blackwood Manor had already begun to circulate, distorted by rumors. Lord Stirling was already there, standing near the Queen's table, looking like a vulture who had finally found its prey. "Ah, the Duke of Blackwood," the Queen's voice rang out, sharp as a guillotine. "We were told you were indisposed. Something about a fire at your estate? And Lady Elara, your mother was quite distraught to find your bed empty this morning." Elara felt the weight of 100 gazes, but she didn't look down. She felt Arthur's arm beneath hers, solid as an oak. She tilted her head, a small, confident smile playing on her lips. "Your Majesty," Elara began, her voice carrying across the hall with perfect clarity. "The rumors of a fire are greatly exaggerated. It was merely a small incident with some unauthorized trespassers. The Duke and I were busy ensuring the safety of certain family interests. In fact, we were so occupied that we realized we could no longer delay the announcement of our engagement." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Lord Stirling's face turned a shade of purple that matched his waistcoat. "Engagement?" Stirling spat, stepping forward. "Your Majesty, this is a farce. I have proof that this man is harboring criminals. I have his ledger." Arthur stepped forward, his presence suddenly overwhelming. He didn't look at Stirling, he looked at the Queen. "Lord Stirling seems to have a strange obsession with my business affairs. Perhaps because they interfere with his own? My ledger, which he so graciously stole, contains the names of families I have supported through my charities. Charities that, I might add, Lord Stirling has been attempting to extort." Elara didn't miss a beat. She pulled a small, folded parchment from her bodice, the document she had secured earlier. And while we are discussing ledgers, Your Majesty, perhaps you would be interested in the shipping manifests of the Sterling Star. It seems the Lord has been avoiding the Crown's taxes on French lace and brandy for years. A curious hobby for a man who claims to be so loyal. The tide turned in an instant. The Queen's eyes narrowed as she looked at Sterling, who was now visibly trembling. The tension in the room was no longer about Arthur and Elara's scandal, it was about the fall of a traitor. "Lord Sterling," the Queen said, her voice cold. "I believe you have some explaining to do to the royal guard. Take him." As the guards led a screaming Sterling away, the Queen turned her gaze back to the couple. She studied them for a long time, their joined hands, the fierce light in Elara's eyes, the protective stance of the Duke. "A duke and a firebrand," the Queen murmured, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "London will certainly be less boring with the two of you. You may stay for breakfast. But I expect a formal invitation to the wedding by the end of the week." They had one. But as they moved toward the buffet, the adrenaline finally began to fade, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion, and a desire that could no longer be ignored. "You are magnificent," Arthur whispered, his breath hot against her ear as he leaned in to pick up a plate. "I think I fell in love with you all over again when you mentioned the French lace." "Only then?" Elara teased, though her heart was racing. "I've been in love with the way you glare at me for months, Arthur." "Then let us leave this den of vipers," he said, his hand sliding down to the small of her back, the touch firm and intentional. "I promise to make you feel alive, Elara. And the day is still young." The chapters that followed were a whirlwind of secret meetings and public triumphs. But the real story happened behind closed doors. In the library of Blackwood Manor, away from the eyes of the ton, the enemies finally laid down their arms. The tension that had defined them for so long didn't disappear, it transformed into a passion that was as deep as it was enduring. Arthur showed her the world he had built, and Elara showed him the heart she had hidden. They were no longer just a duke and a lady, they were two people who had found freedom in each other's arms. The night that changed everything had been just the beginning. The aftermath of the Queen's breakfast was not the quiet victory Elara had expected. While the ton whispered behind their fans about the unlikely match of the decade, a much darker storm was brewing. Arthur knew that Lord Sterling was merely a symptom of a larger rot within the aristocracy. As they returned to Blackwood Manor, the silence between them was no longer one of uncertainty, but of a shared, burning purpose. The tension that had defined their every encounter, the sharp-edged wit and the lingering glances, was now a heavy, intoxicating weight. Inside the grand library, with its walls of ancient leather and the scent of beeswax and old secrets, Arthur finally let the mask fall completely. He shed his tailored coat, his movements uncharacteristically restless. Elara stood by the fireplace, her emerald gown shimmering in the low light, watching him with a gaze that had grown increasingly bold. "You did more than save my reputation today, Elara," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. "You saved a cause that many would kill for. Why risk everything for a man you claimed to despise only a month ago?" Elara stepped toward him, the silk of her skirts rustling like a secret whispered in the dark. "I never despised you, Arthur. I despised the cage I was in. You were just the only man brave enough to show me the key. And perhaps I hated how much I wanted you to use it." The air in the library seemed to vanish. Arthur moved with the speed of a predator, closing the gap until he had her backed against the mahogany shelves. He didn't touch her, but his heat was an invitation and a challenge. I promise to make you feel alive, he whispered, his thumb finally tracing the pulse at the base of her throat. But life is messy. It's painful. It's a fire that consumes everything it touches. Are you ready to burn? I've been waiting for the spark since the moment we met, she replied, her voice a breathless vow. The night that followed was a symphony of everything they had been forced to repress. It was the dissolution of the Duke and the Lady into simply Arthur and Elara. In the sanctuary of his rooms, the secrets of the state were forgotten, replaced by the discovery of one another. But as the first light of dawn touched the heavy velvet curtains, the real world came knocking. A messenger arrived with a seal that couldn't be ignored. The king's advisors weren't as easily swayed as the queen. They demanded an audit of the duke's charities. The battle wasn't over, it had merely shifted to the legal halls of power. For weeks, they fought side by side. Elara became the strategist, using her social standing to gather intelligence, while Arthur navigated the treacherous waters of the House of Lords. The enemies to lovers arc had reached its ultimate form. They were a partnership of equals. The desire that had once been a distraction was now their greatest strength, a tether that kept them grounded when the world tried to pull them under. In the end, it was Elara who found the final piece of the puzzle, a record of Sterling's associates that implicated high-ranking officials in the very crimes they tried to pin on Arthur. The day of the hearing, she didn't sit in the gallery like a silent observer. She stood by his side, a defiant figure in sapphire silk, proving that the Duke of Blackwood was no longer a lone wolf. When the verdict of no case to answer was finally read, the silence that fell over the court was deafening. They had won. Truly, finally won. Years later, the story of the night at Vauxhall would be told and retold. Some said it was a night of scandal, others a night of rebellion. But for Elara and Arthur, it was simply the night the walls came down. The Duke had promised to make her feel alive, and he had kept his word, not through a fleeting moment of passion, but by giving her a life worth living, a love worth fighting for, and a partner who never once asked her to dim her light. As they stood together on the balcony of their home, watching their own children play in the gardens that once hid orphans, they knew that what they did that night didn't just change their lives, it changed the very heart of the world they lived in. The silence of the library was a living thing, thick with the scent of old parchment, expensive brandy, and the unspoken promises of the night before. Elara stood by the window, watching the London fog roll in, a grey shroud over a city that still didn't know it was about to be shaken to its foundations. She could feel Arthur's presence behind her, even without turning. It was a magnetic pull, a heat that seemed to radiate through the layers of her silk gown. "You're thinking about the ledger," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a thrill of both fear and desire through her. "I'm thinking about how easily a life can be dismantled by a single book," Elara replied, finally turning to face him. Arthur had discarded his cravat, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the corded muscles of his neck. He looked less like a duke and more like the rebel she had fallen for. "Sterling is gone, but the men who funded him, they are still sitting at the Queen's table, Arthur." Arthur stepped into her space, his hands coming to rest on the window frame on either side of her, effectively trapping her. The proximity was a physical ache. "Then we give them a reason to tremble. I didn't spend a decade building a sanctuary for the helpless just to watch it burn because of a few greedy lords." His eyes searched hers, a dark, swirling sapphire blue that seemed to demand everything she had to give. "I promise to make you feel alive, Elara. But this life, my life, is a constant battle. I would understand if you chose to step back into the safety of the ballroom." Elara reached up, her fingers grazing the rough stubble on his jaw. The ballroom was never safe, Arthur. It was a slow death. I'd rather face 1,000 sterlings with you than one more season of empty smiles. The tension snapped then. It wasn't a gentle surrender, but a desperate collision. The kiss tasted of salt and secrets, a fierce confirmation of their pact. In that library, surrounded by the wisdom of the past, they forged a future that belonged to them alone. But their sanctuary was soon interrupted. A messenger arrived with news that sent a chill through the manor. The royal guard had not only found the ledger but were being pressured by a faction of the House of Lords to arrest Arthur for treason before he could present his evidence. They had only hours. "We go to the Queen," Elara said, her voice hard as diamond. "Not as petitioners, but as witnesses. If the law won't protect you, the crown must." The journey to the palace was a blur of high-speed carriages and whispered strategies. Every time their hands met under the carriage blanket, Elara felt the strength of their bond. They were no longer enemies, they were a revolution of two. At the palace, the confrontation was epic. The Queen, usually a bastion of decorum, found herself in the middle of a political firestorm. Elara stepped forward, using her sharp wit to dismantle the arguments of the corrupt lords, while Arthur presented the hard evidence of their crimes. The tension in the throne room was so thick it was palpable. When the Queen finally spoke, her voice was like ice. "It seems my court has been infested with vipers. Duke Blackwood, you have done a great service to this kingdom, even if your methods were unconventional." She turned her gaze to Elara. "And you, Lady Elara. I suspect you are the true architect of this victory. London will never be the same with you as its Duchess." The victory was complete, but the cost was high. They were now the most powerful, and most scrutinized, couple in England. As they walked out of the palace, the sun finally broke through the fog. Years passed, and the sanctuary in the cellar grew into a network of schools and hospitals, funded by the Blackwood fortune and managed by Elara's sharp mind. The Duke who made her feel alive became the man who gave her a world to change. And every year, on the anniversary of that night at Vauxhall, they would return to the old oak by the lake. "Do you regret it?" Arthur asked her one evening, his arm around her waist as they watched the moon rise. "The scandal? The danger?" Elara leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart, the heart of the man she had once called an enemy. "I only regret that I didn't find the key sooner," she whispered. "Because every second I spent not loving you was a second I wasn't truly breathing." They stood together, a duke and his duchess, two rebels who had turned a night of promised ruin into a lifetime of revolutionary love. The world had tried to break them, but instead, they had remade the world. If you love timeless romance, noble scandals, and unforgettable stories, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and explore the other tales on our channel. Your next favorite love story might be just one click away.